Hello and welcome to this NET Back to Basics video, focusing today on AQA Literature Paper 2, Section A. Now the idea in each of these videos is that we'll be talking through a simple summary version of the key points as quickly as we can. Now today we're going to focus on An Inspector Calls as a play and how we approach that text in the exam. So, Literature Paper 2. Now this paper lasts 2 hours and 15 minutes, or about 2 3/4 hours if you have that 25% extra time. Now this time the paper splits into 3 sections. Section A is the modern section, Section B is the anthology poetry, and Section C is the unseen poetry. Now for most people watching this, that would be the combination of Section A on An Inspector Calls, Section B on the power and conflict poetry, and Section C on unseen poetry. Simplifying a bit, Section A is worth 34 marks because it includes the SPAG, the AO4. Section B is worth 30 marks, and Section C is worth 32 marks. Now, rather than faffing around, you basically want to split your time into 3, and therefore spend about 45 minutes on each of those sections. For the modern text question, there's going to be a whole range of questions on a range of different texts. So your first task in the exam is to find the questions on An Inspector Calls, and they should be on page 4. Now for the modern text, you're given 2 choices for the question. You'll often find that one of those is a character question, and that the other is a theme question. However, it's entirely possible that both could be character-led, or that both could be theme-led. What you will spot as being a difference from the previous exam is there's no extract for the Inspector Calls questions or for any of the modern text questions. What that means is you'll need to know enough quotations to cover the various options that could come up. Now the question can be phrased a few different ways. So it could ask you, how does Priestley, or how far does Priestley, or even give you a statement and ask you what you think of that statement. Whatever it looks like, you're asked about how the writer presents a character, or characters, or a theme, or some combination of those. Now, as ever, whether the question is on a theme or a character is nothing to worry about. A question about a character also links to themes. A question about a theme has to link to characters. So basically, a character question is also a theme question, and a theme question is also a character question, so there's no need to be scared of either. You're given bullet points for the question, which essentially just remind you to talk about the whole text and to focus on the writer's choices. And then you're given the marks. Now there are 34 marks to this question, and you're marked on, firstly, your ideas about the task and the text and how you explain them. Secondly, your choice of quotations and how you use them. Thirdly, how you talk about the writer's choices, the techniques and the effect that they have. And then you're also marked on how you discuss the big ideas in the text and possibly talk about the context. To simplify somewhat, 4 marks of that 34 are for your technical accuracy. So you do need to make sure you're careful with things like capital letters and punctuation. Now in terms of the essay you write, you're probably going to manage around 4 to 6 paragraphs in total. And because there's no extract to read about or write about, those all need to come from your knowledge of the text as a whole. As ever, good advice is to basically follow the story from the start to the end. Now, because An Inspector Calls includes loads of useful characters, it can be tempting to try and write about a lot of them, or even all of them. Good advice, however, is to keep it really clean and clear and streamlined, rather than trying to talk about everybody. Covering lots of characters means there's a risk of your essay just becoming bitty, being fragmented, and lacking a clear sense of direction and cohesion. So what can we prepare in advance? Well, we can't know in advance which character the question will focus on. We can't know which theme it might link to. However, the play is An Inspector Calls, and the entire thing is structured around the investigation into the death of Eva Smith. That means that certain characters are particularly useful, including the inspector and Eva Smith. People also often find Birling a useful character to focus on because he begins everything. He influences people. He goes first in terms of the investigation. He talks a lot. And he also symbolises some of the biggest social problems. Sheila can also be quite productive, I think, in terms of being the clearest indication of someone learning and changing. That also means that there are certain themes you'll probably be able to talk about because they're the big hitting themes to do with the central message of the text. So there's social class, gender, capitalism and socialism, and also the mismatch between the generations, as in the tensions between the generations. So what I need for this question is a series of quotations and points ready for each character that could come up, possibly leaning on characters such as the Inspector, Eva Smith, Mr. Birling and Sheila. Don't forget though that you can link characters and you can contrast them. You could contrast, for example, the Inspector and Mr. Birling. You could contrast Sheila and Eva, and so on. So in terms of my basic Inspector essay, so if the Inspector came up as a character, this is probably what I would try and do. So I'd start at the beginning of the play. The Inspector is intended to instantly create a sense of authority and power, and he contrasts with Mr. Birling. The quotation I'd use is from the stage direction in Act 1. He creates at once an impression of massiveness, solidity, and purposefulness. I'll then go to a little bit later that the Inspector is a figure of moral authority from the beginning of the play. And I'd link into that quotation, it's better to ask for the earth than to take it. I might then go a little bit further on to Act 2, when he reprimands the Birlings for their misbehaviour and shows a clear social awareness. And that lovely quotation from Act 2 from the Inspector, public men, Mr. Birling, have responsibilities as well as privileges. For my fourth one, I want to go a little bit further on, and I might go for a point along the lines of the fact the Inspector influences and shows hope for the younger generation and their capacity to change. And the quotation to go with that might be, you seem to have made a great impression on this child, Inspector, and that's from Mrs. Birling in Act 2. Now for my fifth one, I'm just tracking the play through. So I'm going to go for, I think, the Inspector's big speech when he leaves. So my point would be that by the time he leaves, it's clear that he's a mouthpiece for Priestley's message of collective responsibility and valuing each other. So I'm also building those concepts, building those ideas. And the quotation for that would be, we don't live alone, we are members of one body. And that's from the Inspector. And then my last one needs to be like one of the last things that he says, but also a point that gives me the whole play and the whole point of the play. So I might go for, ultimately, the Inspector also warns the Birlings of the consequences if society does not change. And the quotation would be, if men will not learn that lesson, they'll be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. And that's from the Inspector in Act 3. And that means I've built to essentially Priestley's key message in the play and the overall function of the Inspector. Now what that means is that my basic line of discussion would be along the lines of, as it says here, the Inspector is intended to instantly create a sense of authority and power, contrasting with Birling, and he's a figure of moral authority from the beginning of the play. However, he also reprimands the Birlings for their misbehaviour and shows a clear social awareness, and he's influencing and showing hope for the younger generation and their capacity to change. By the time he leaves, it's also clear that he's a mouthpiece for Priestley's message of collective responsibility and of valuing each other. And, ultimately, the Inspector warns the Birlings of the consequences if society does not change. Now, obviously, there are literally hundreds of other quotations, either from or about the Inspector, that I could use. After all, I've got some here from Mrs. Birling about the Inspector rather than actually directly from him. But those, I think, here would be the spine of my discussion, and I might link in some others as I go. Now, this works as a structure because, as ever with these things, it covers the whole play from the start to the end. It links to really the key messages, the big ideas in the play. And it also links to, or links in, some of the other key characters. Now, obviously, I'd need to analyse each of those quotations, talk about features, methods, words to zoom in on, and I'd need to link as well to things like concepts and context. But that would be the basic framework of my Inspector essay. Now to turn to Mr. Birling. So this is what my Mr. Birling essay might look like. So first of all, I'd start at the beginning of the play. So Birling is critical of socialism and social equality and the idea of social conscience from the very beginning of the play. The quotation I'd use is probably this one, all mixed up together like bees in a hive, and that's from Mr. Birling in Act 1. I'll then go a little bit forwards that Birling is used to symbolise the problems in society, including an arrogant overconfidence and a self-involved certainty. And I'd go for the quotation, "There isn't a chance of war." I'd probably also link that, if I'm honest, to unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable, and do those together. Partially because I think that image of the Titanic and the way it symbolises Mr. Birling and capitalism and the middle class and so on, it symbolises all these useful things all in one little package. I'd then go for a point, again a little bit further on, and Mr. Birling is very clear in his positive view of self-interest, selfishness, and a capitalist mindset, and he's passing that view down to his children. So I'm broadening out a bit. And the quotation I'd use is, "A man has to mind his own business, look after himself and his own, and that's, of course, Mr. Birling in Act 1. I'll go forward a little bit from that, I think, to Birling being interviewed by the inspector, and that line where he objectifies his workers in the quotation, "With several hundred young women, she was a lively, good-looking girl, country-bred, I fancy," and link in those two quotations kind of into one, and the way he obviously views his workers, but particularly the way he views Eva Smith, and that suggestion that he objectifies her. I'd then link in, I think, to the way he reacts to when he's being interviewed. So Birling also shows a complete lack of understanding as to the impact of his actions. And that quotation, "I can't accept any responsibility. If we were all responsible for everything that happened to everybody we'd had anything to do with, it would be very awkward, wouldn't it?" And that's Birling in Act 1. Obviously that's a long quotation, so I might just cherry pick 2 or 3 bits from it. Now my last one, actually, I need to leap ahead at this point to the end of the play, because I've already got 5 points. So I might go for, ultimately, Birling, representing the older generation, the middle class and men, shows a complete lack of understanding and an inability to change. And I go for the quotations, "I give thousands, yes thousands," or possibly the famous young generation who know it all and they can't even take a joke. And those final quotations help to link in this bigger point about Birling and his lack of change and therefore what he represents. Now what that means is that my basic line of discussion, again for Birling, would be that Birling is critical of socialism and social conscience from the beginning, and he's used in the play to symbolise the problems in society, including an arrogant overconfidence and a self-involved certainty. Birling's also very clear in his positive view of self-interest, of selfishness and a capitalist mindset, and that he's passing that view down to his children. Now Birling objectifies his workers and shows a complete lack of understanding as to the impact of his actions. And ultimately, Birling, representing the older generation, representing the middle class and symbolising men, shows a complete lack of understanding and an inability to change. Again, loads of different quotations I could choose, and everyone will have their favourites, but I do think those work as a possible set, and for the same reasons as ever. They cover the whole play, they're linking other characters. I'd need to analyse, obviously, so features, methods, words to zoom in on, that kind of thing. I need to link, of course, to concepts and context, but that would give me, again, a basic framework for an essay. Now, an Eva Smith essay is a funny one, because although Eva Smith is a character, or at least is treated as a character in the play, she doesn't directly speak during the play. She uses multiple names, Eva Smith, Daisy Renton, Mrs. Birling, and it isn't even clear that she's a single person anyway, or a real person. Now, were we to build a basic plan for an Eva Smith essay, we'd have to rely then on things that other people say about her. And what that might end up looking is something like this. So first of all, at the beginning of the play, Eva Smith's death is the event that begins and ends the entire narrative. And it's both horrific and it's also a final act to taking control. And I might use the inspector's line. She swallowed a lot of strong disinfectant, burnt her insides out, of course, and that's from the inspector in Act 1. I then might go for how she's viewed by Birling. So, from the beginning, Eva Smith is defined by her physical appearance and by her attractiveness, as well as being an outsider figure. And that line from Birling, she was a lively, good-looking girl, country-bred, I fancy, and that's Birling in Act 1. I might then build from that into maybe Gerald and Eva Smith, and this idea that, for my third point, for the men who encounter her, Eva is simply seen as an object to be used, and that her innocence, her difference, her youth, and her attractiveness are things that cause her to be used and abused. And that quotation from Gerald in Act 2, she looks young and fresh and charming, and altogether out of place. I might then link from that and beyond the male treatment of her to the female treatment of her, and go for Mrs. Birling, also in Act 2. And this idea that Eva Smith's treatment shows the prejudiced and judgmental view of the middle and upper classes towards those who are weaker than them, those who refuse to understand or sympathise, in terms of the middle and upper classes. And that quotation, as if a girl of that sort would ever refuse money, from Mrs. Birling in Act 2. Now, I do need to keep moving through the play with this, so I might then go for Eric, and this idea that having been used and rejected by those who encounter her, Eva Smith is ultimately objectified, exploited, without any kind of attempt at understanding or sympathy. And that line from Eric, I wasn't in love with her or anything, but I liked her. She was pretty and a good sport. And the way that it shows absolutely no understanding or awareness of the severity or the implications of his actions towards her. And then at the end, to draw it together, of course, because I'm tracking it through the play, from the inspector, ultimately Eva Smith symbolises the plight of the weakest groups in society, and those groups essentially being here, women in the working class. And that quotation, there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us, from the inspector in Act 3. Now again, there's a bit of a kind of a précis or a summary of the line of discussion here. What that means is that it ends up being Eva Smith's death is the event that begins and ends the entire narrative, and it's both horrific and a final act of taking control. Now, from the beginning, Eva Smith is defined by her physical appearance and by her attractiveness, as well as being an outsider figure. For the men who encounter her, she's simply seen as an object to be used, and her innocence, her difference, her youth and her attractiveness are all things that cause her to be used and abused. Eva Smith's treatment also shows the prejudiced and judgmental view of the middle and upper classes towards those who are weaker than them. That's essentially these people who refuse to understand or to sympathise. Having been used and rejected by those who encounter her, she is ultimately objectified and exploited without any kind of attempt at understanding. Now, ultimately, Eva Smith symbolises the plight of the weakest groups in society, women and the working class. Again, as ever, lots of quotations we could have had, but those do, I think, seem to do the job. And again, of course, analysis needed, features, methods, words, and concepts and context. I'll just do one last character, and we'll do Sheila Birling. Now, my Sheila essay would look something along these lines. So again, I'd start near the beginning of the play. So at the beginning of the play, Sheila is presented as naive and heavily influenced by the men in her life. And that quotation from Sheila to Gerald, is it the one you want me to have? And that's about the ring, that's Sheila in Act 1. I'd then go forward a little bit, and this idea that, however, there are early signs that Sheila is not beyond redemption, that she's willing to challenge those in power. And that quotation from Sheila to her father, these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people, and that's Sheila in Act 1. And then I think link in Sheila being interviewed, again, still in Act 1. The idea that although Sheila has made mistakes, it's also clear that she's aware of and accepts the consequences of her actions. And that quotation, I felt rotten about it at the time, and now I feel a lot worse. That's Sheila, again, in Act 1. I might then move forwards into Act 2. The idea that Sheila's change also shows the positive potential impact of the inspector and the ability of the young generation to change. And Mrs. Birling's line, you seem to have made a great impression on this child inspector, from Act 2. Carrying on moving through the play then, I might go for the idea that Sheila becomes a positive agent of change. She's attempting to influence others for the better. And that quotation from Sheila to her mother, you mustn't try to build up a kind of a wall between us and that girl, and that's Sheila in Act 2. Now, as ever, I need to make sure I'm covering the whole play, so I then go for the end of Act 3, that Sheila shows a positive path to redemption for society as a whole, and the lasting impact of the inspector. And that quotation from Sheila after the inspector's left, I remember what he said, how he looked, and how he made me feel. Fire and blood and anguish. Now, as ever, I do want to make sure that this makes sense as a discussion. So if this were a single cohesive paragraph, it would be something along the lines of, at the beginning of the play, Sheila is presented as naive and heavily influenced by the men in her life. However, there are early signs that Sheila is not beyond redemption, that she is willing to challenge those in power. Although Sheila has made mistakes, it's clear that she is aware of and accepts the consequences of her actions. Sheila's change also shows the positive potential impact of the inspector, and also the ability of the young generation to change. Sheila becomes a positive agent of change, attempting to influence others for the better, and she shows a positive path to redemption for society as a whole, and also the lasting impact of Inspector. As ever, lots of possible quotations, but these I do think give me a logical line of discussion that I can follow, that I can use. And as ever, don't forget, you need to analyse the quotations, methods, features, words, concepts, and context. So, top tips just to summarise. Firstly, make sure you answer on the correct text. Sounds obvious? It's an important point. Secondly, only answer one of the two questions on the text. Thirdly, spend about 45 minutes answering this question, or that's around 56 minutes if you have extra time. Fourthly, make sure you have points and quotations for the key characters and the key themes ready. And obviously those 4 characters tend to be the most useful ones. Do read the question carefully, so that you make sure that you pick out the correct focus for the question. Aim for and plan for around 4 to 6 paragraphs, and that means essentially making 4 to 6 key points about 4 to 6 key quotations, although you can weave in short quotations as you go as well. And then lastly, make sure you write your essay chronologically, so track the narrative from the beginning to the end. Now, as ever, if you are aiming higher, focus on the depth and the range. Analysis is important, but as ever, you're not necessarily marked higher for discussions around obscure technical features. It's the effect and the impact that's important. Showing you have an understanding of how the whole play slots together is really useful. And consider multiple layers of meaning, especially as you analyse. You pick out a feature, is there more than one way of interpreting that feature? Focus, if possible, on tracking concepts, themes and images. Motifs can also be a useful way of doing that. Now, context for Inspector Calls is useful, and it's hard not to write an essay about it without discussing the socialism-capitalism question, the context of the wars and so on. However, remember that this isn't a history essay. You need to make sure that whatever context you discuss comes from the text itself, rather than being something outside the text you bring them into it. As ever, themes and concepts are a much safer way of accessing the high marks for AO3. Right, hopefully that's been useful. Thank you very much for listening. As ever, don't forget that there's a whole range of videos on the Net English YouTube channel, Net English 1, covering a whole range of different topics, texts, characters, quotation explosions, themes, concepts, all of it. Thank you very much and take care.